Alrighty then. It is the night before I drive to Kansas for the Materia Cup, which means it's time for a tier list. Kind of like last time, I really didn't have time to sit down and do the full PowerPoint the way I did before. So we're going to have to make do with what we have, which is I'm going to kind of just click through this Google Drive a little bit as I go through. Disclaimer, here's my opinion. I'm not omniscient. Game is pretty open and unsolved. There's room for undiscovered decks to be top cut, and people might not recognize that they're top tier until they actually win events. I'm attempting to tier the meta. I try to use results, but I have personal biases, and nothing I say is meant to be comprehensive, more so just kind of a general metagame guide and vibe check. Tier list descriptors. Tier 1, these are the decks that you should expect to see at top cut or winning events. They are the decks to beat. Tier 2, they're going to be less common. They're going to probably have a couple of bad matchups here or there that might mean they need a favorable bracket or some kind of an innovation that really hasn't been discovered to actually win, at which point they probably would slide up to tier 1. They are capable of winning events. I do think any deck that is in tier 1 or tier 2 is capable of winning a Materia Cup. Tier 3, this is the bottom of what I would expect to get in the top cut. I don't expect them to win events, but I do think they could actually, get, round 2, round 3 of top cut. Rogue, these are decks that have severe enough flaws that I think that they should not make top cut, but they will upset you in Swiss rounds if you're unprepared. Everything else, just, I'm not going to go into details on these, but these are decks that just, you don't really have to know to understand the metagame as a whole. So this was my Beyond Destiny tier list at the end of the set, or when I made it. I always like kind of looking at this as a way of kind of tracking where I was, how I was right, how I was wrong. And I think I was pretty much spot on. I think Giga Wall really was the best game in town by far. I think Ice Aggro ended up being kind of a counter meta strat, as did everything else. I went over this in the other video. But I think Refia Control might need to have been in tier 1.5 given the representation in Japan specifically. And Mono Wind did actually win an event, as did Earthwind. Yay me. But no, in general, I don't really hate anything in this. So let's go into Hidden Hope. Alright, so this is the Hidden Hope tier list. I think the best deck in the game is Refia Control, but I don't think it's by a lot. So Refia Control, if you haven't seen it, is the deck that plays the Opus 19 Refia Legend and a bunch of Warrior of Light backups to essentially put the game in a situation where they can't win. And Refia just does everything. She's a mana doubler, she's a removal spell, she's a draw engine for some reason. And not only is she a removal spell, she's the best removal spell in the game. The downside is Warrior of Light backups suck. With a couple of exceptions, there aren't any real engine ways of doing that, which has led to the innovation of the new Bartz. Bartz is a card you'll see anywhere from not in the deck at all, which was the Japanese winning list, to I've seen 9 and heard rumors of people playing up to 12 Bartzes in decks. I don't think that I would ever go that high. You kind of run into an issue where you want your top decks to be live, and your top deck Bartzes are only live if you have Bartz on field. He's sticky, but not immovable. There are ways of removing him that could be a problem for him. But it's interesting. I do think that there is an argument in the future. It sucks because this is actually a deck that's usually my locals is relatively casual. People play non-meta and do very well. This deck has started really snuffing out people, and it's actually causing a couple of my friends to kind of take a break from the game, which sucks. I really don't like that. It's kind of why I really wish this game would be more aggressive with bans, and I know that it would be unfortunate to lose cards that I spent good money on, but I really don't like seeing people kind of get frustrated with the game because of the power level of the top decks, and that's where we're at with Refia Control and Giga Wall and Knights. Giga Wall is effectively the same deck as last set. I do think there's a new variant that could pop up. I was experimenting a lot with Category 8 Giga Wall. Turns out that Irvine and Cypher both cost 3, and allows you to play your Ice Lightning cards like Zeromus a lot more natively. There's still also the ability to play Mono Water Giga Wall, which I think is just as good. Turns out Giga Wall is just the best ramp spell in the game. It's kind of funny that the card ended up being as broken as it is, but it really is ludicrous that you can go turn 1 backup, turn 2, 7-drop 9k, 2 backups, 4 cards in hand. You just out tempo everything in the game at that point. As the other people call Giga Wall an aggro deck, I actually don't agree at all. I don't think Giga Wall is at its best aggro. I always consider it more of a tempo type of deck where it's like tempo with the best finisher payload the game has ever had in Gilgamesh FFBE. And even if, and the thing is, Gilgamesh FFBE doesn't just end the game, but oftentimes it's also completely untargetable while it's ending the game. So even EX bursts don't solve the problem a lot of the time. Incredibly strong deck, and one that honestly is very difficult to play against as well. Even something that if you break the Giga Wall, you're kind of just setting them up. And actually, the Category 8 variant doesn't even need to have the Giga Wall broken to set up the Gilgamesh FFBE. So no, this deck is still obscenely powerful. And every bit as good. And if you're not preparing to beat this deck, you will lose to it. Lastly, in Tier 1, this is a weird one, because I don't know how much I believe this. But Knights have been the most represented deck in Japan by far. And I mean, it's not even close. We're talking probably 25 to 30% representation for entry, and probably about 50% of all top cut slots are being taken by Knights right now. It is not winning events. I don't know how much credence to place in that. It's one of those things where it's like, it was undefeated in Swiss, which was 7 rounds, and it lost 1 round in top cut. So I can't really say, it can't win top cut. I don't believe that that's the case for any deck. I believe that there are decks that are worse when your opponent knows what you're playing. I think 13 is a good example of a deck that does better in Swiss than it does in top cut, but Steve Sauce proved that 13 can win top cut. So I don't think that Knights can't get there. I do think, though, that Knights does run into a lot of weird things. The hands where you hit Laswell off of Corilla are just completely different card games than when you hit anything else. And without Ramza, it can actually struggle with removal. And Ramza is a little scary to play because I think a lot of decks are, thanks to all the Category 8 stuff running around, playing a lot of cards like Mist Dragon or cards like Amaterasu to deal with Giga Wall. So it really is kind of a strange deck to see in Tier 1. It's one that I'm not sure I believe isn't 1.5 or Tier 2, but it is probably the best aggro deck in the format. And I do think that it's just flexible enough for me to like it over a lot of the other aggro decks in the format right now. Turns out Laswell is just a hell of a card still. Tier 1.5, we have 4-color good stuff. This deck was already doing well last set. It's doing better this set, I think, in part because I think it makes very good use of Leo. A lot of time this deck, 4-color decks for a long time were essentially 2-color decks that were splashing cards to get to the last colors. Something like a Tyro for wind and the Class Moogle for fire, right? But now it's almost like a true 4-color package. And I've seen this everything from just we're going to play all the good multi-elements to we're going to play twins with this to we're going to play Steve D put a Warriors deck tech out on this. And you just get to kind of play the best stuff in Fire, Wind, Water, and Earth. And I think it's kind of the biggest problematic part of Warrior of Light is that it encourages this. I feel like when I started playing the game, there's a lot of like 2-color decks. Maybe you would splash Tyro to play a third off-color card like Lock and Wind, but 4-color stuff just was not as omnipresent. And Warrior of Light really makes it worth doing. I do think that it loses out to Refia control in a long game. Refia is just so much more powerful and so much more available when the backups are also Warriors of Light. But this deck does have a lot of ability to play through things that Refia control can't. It's kind of faster and more consistent because the backups are so much better in general. Wind, X, Storm, where X can be pretty much anything. I think Ice, I think Mono Wind, I think Earth Wind, and I think Lightning Wind especially is very slept on right now. Lightning in general is just in a really good spot, and the ability to have access to... The biggest thing about Wind right now for me is the complete lack of good LB cards in the element. Yuri is effectively a blank card. And Ace doesn't really do anything special. I like the card. I like that I don't have to think, and that if I'm kind of getting burned out on resources in deck, I still always have access to this like one extra board wipe. But I wouldn't be surprised to see like Mono Wind start splashing Philo so we can start playing Leo and actually make good use of a mechanic that is kind of tailor-made towards casting more cards because you just have extra cards to cast over the course of a game. I think Lightning with the class Moogle tapping for water and access to cards like Garuda and Cloud could be very, very strong, but it's a bit unexplored. And I still think that Retainer Storm still does the exact same things it did last set. I took it as, you know, I called it an anti-meta call as the deck that could handle both aggression and Giga Wall, and it's still kind of capable of doing that. So I think it's a very good deck, but one that requires the right pilot, the right room, and the right bracket in order to actually win the event. Mono Fire has had a big resurgence thanks to Montleonis, and Minwoo in particular has really shown up big in this deck. And there's not too much to say. Jekt is incredible. Montleonis gives the deck a reason to exist and a finisher payload. And it's actually very well positioned against Refia control because it's very hard to maintain the Refia. The Refia control decks are very threat light. Usually they're on somewhere in the realm of 15 to 20 cards that are not uniquely named forwards. You know, some number of backups and spare Bartzes, for instance. The list in Italy was playing even forward arc and really not intending to cast it, just have it as an EX burst they could pull out late game if they didn't need it. And Mono Fire can feast on that. You can Brynhilde or Ifrit away the Bartz, and now all of a sudden Refia Control's game plan can kind of fall apart, and all these extra Bartzes in your hand don't really do a lot anymore. So I think it's very strong, but I think it's very specific, and I think it has counterplay. Again, it loses to a lot of the same hate that Giga Wall and Knights do, without necessarily the speed or the strong engines that those decks are running, that like the good control decks are running. So it can't really pivot to a control game plan against them. I think Final Fantasy VIII's Lightning package is completely busted. I think that Raijin is a card that I would see as a candidate for a ban in the future. I just don't think that you can have a Narcomoeba / Wolf that has haste. I think that's just was a terrible, terrible decision. I've seen this played mono Lightning. I've seen Ice Lightning. I've seen Fire Lightning. I've seen, like I said, this mixed with Giga Wall. It's just good. If you're playing Lightning and you can spare, I think it's, the engine is what? 3, 6, 9, 12, 14 slots. I think you really can't go wrong with it. And the sheer coverage that it provides. Mono Water. If you're good at Mono Water, it's going to be pretty solid this format. Leviathan, it does a very good job against Giga Wall. Poor Minka Cullen in particular can really help deal with that aggro that's kind of coming at you perpetually. And Lena Leviathan is still just as strong a payoff as it has been, as is Ash, honestly. Ash is still maybe the best card in the deck. And lastly, Chaos Arc. All variants. Earth Water is probably the most common one, but Earth Lightning and Mono Lightning also see a fair amount of play. Basically, anything that has access to either Man in Black or Une with Chaos Arc. You got a big buff thanks to Leela, means that you can draw Arc and not necessarily need the Chaos. You can kind of pay 5 for the Leela and then pay the remaining 4 for the Arc, and it's like you paid for the Arc, but you just get a free body developed out of it too. Kind of turns Leela into a 9 CP, break a forward, your opponent discards a card, and then keeps her on attack trigger. I wouldn't be surprised to see a lot of this in Kansas, given that it's expected to have a good matchup into Refia Control and Giga Wall, but I do have a lot of fears about that matchup for the deck in particular, namely that Refia Control can get so wide so fast that the Chaos Arc game plan actually doesn't matter anymore. The Refia Control decks are sometimes very happy to just dump their hands into getting a big wide field, donating something like a Bart's, and then, okay, you killed the Refia with the Arc, well, I'll revive it with Lena next turn, and then I'll spin the Bart's to the top of my deck, draw it, and we're right back where we started. So I don't think this is a surefire answer to Refia Control, but I think it's going to be tested a lot as maybe the answer to what is expected to be the best deck, and probably one of the decks you'll see a lot of the better players in the room play. I would not be surprised to see like the Matt Okimotos or the KPs of the world playing this as like anybody that played mono water, I guess, in the 13 format, Opus 19 to Opus 20. Tier 2, Ice Aggro, I think, lost a lot thanks to the Limit Break deck. Victora's a good card in the deck, but Victora also answers the deck very cleanly. Cards like even Leo, for instance. I liken Leo a lot to a card like Bellringer Angel and Shadowverse Evolve. It's just kind of a free forward that draws a card and blocks a point of damage. And turns out 1 CP to block a point of damage is just more than worth it for any deck that's trying to scale into aggro. And I actually think Leela is a big nerf because it's going to be in so many Limit Break decks. And it makes Sid Randell an unreliable win condition now because every deck now has a 5 CP out to Sid Randell in 2 turns. Ice Lightning, still very good. It has the best Limit Break deck in the game. I think Victoria and Cloud are better than just about anything else. Maybe Water Lightning is better in the Limit Break department, but it's very close, and Ice Lightning is just very, very strong. I have Mono Earth. This is probably mostly monsters, but I think Mono Earth Forward still has some potential as kind of a very slow, grindy deck that can continuously wipe the board against aggro and then kind of go for the win. A lot of these decks, by the way, are going to fold very hard to win decks. 13 Megissa, I'm downgrading to tier 2. A lot of 13's power is gone now that Vanille is just going to die to Cloud and they'll trade even. It was very difficult to do that previously. And I think that that's probably going to gatekeep it and force it to play backups, which it doesn't necessarily want to do. Megissa is... a lot of that power was concentrated in Yuzuki exactly. And again, Cloud is everywhere, so Yuzuki is a lot less able to consistently stick to the field. They still can do their things, but I think the Limit Break deck giving consistent access to removal and engines to deal with them is going to ultimately cause their kind of slow downfall kind of out of the meta until new support arrives or until the current tier 1 decks rotate out of the meta. Twins Warriors, I put them down in tier 2. They're just not seeing results outside of Europe really for the most part. I have Warriors of Darkness in tier 2. It has a very bad Refia Control matchup, but does do very well into everything else. I just don't think you really want to be taking in a deck that has a bad matchup into Refia to a major event. And you can kind of ignore Refia potentially. Or like, not ignore Refia, ignore Knocked into Refia and just say, well, If I don't draw him turn 1, I just can't field him. He won't stick long enough, and I'm not gonna get any value out of him. But I think that the deck is too all in on that game plan, and can't really pivot away from it consistently enough or often enough for me to really recommend taking Warriors of Darkness. I think it's a very good deck. I think it's a very fun deck. I just think that the one matchup it needs to be okay into, it just is not there. Similarly, I think monks can be good. I think the Sophie restriction still is really holding this deck back. I'd like to see Sophie go back to 3. And I say this as someone that has exactly 1 copy of the card and would very much want to get a full playset if that were to happen. Actually makes me curious how much Sophie actually costs. Apologies, I don't really have a ton of time, so I'm trying to blast through a lot of these and not pull up individual cards on FF decks. If you need to, go pause the video, go to FF deck, go to Materia Hunter, or go watch my deck breakdown video from a couple days ago. Samurais, I think it's just kind of worse mono fire good stuff, but Tenzen is still a very strong card, as it turns out. And especially what it ends up doing is it kind of purifies your deck and gets kind of a lot of these backups out of it very early, so you can actually play the mono fire good stuff late game. Soiree is still kind of just the bad version of mono 4-color good stuff, but the engine's still solid enough to be worth playing if you enjoy it. Scions is weird because I think it's a modifier you can apply to any deck that's playing lightning cards, and it doesn't make the deck worse necessarily. This is more so referring to the mono lightning, EX burst decks that we were seeing in Opus 20 and occasionally at the Winter Cup. But I do think that you can run, say, FF8 with Scions, and that deck is significantly better than its placement here is going to show. Or Chaos Arc with Scions, for instance. And lastly, Earth Water Summoners I think is still a very interesting deck, even if it's a lot harder to stick the Refia. I think Cecil is still a really, really strong card. I think that even if you weren't running that, you could run the Summoner package where you have the Refia and the Yuna and then a bunch of 2-cost summons alongside Braska's Final Aeon, and kind of just win the game on the spot once you kind of establish that lock. Tier 3, these are decks with a lot of potential. I could see a lot of these rising over the course of the set, but I also can see them falling. Leo is still kind of the wind version of mono water. I still hate this deck. I really think it's frustratingly poorly designed and problematic in the way that it plays the game. But it is going to be gatekept by a lot of the aggro that you're going to see in the format, like Ice Lightning, 13, Magissa. I think the FF8 package, I think Giga Wall, Knights, all these decks are going to have very good matchups into Leo and probably gatekeep it out of the format. But Leo is one of the very few decks that goes toe-to-toe with wins late game. Fran Turbo, I've seen good things, and I've seen games where this deck completely pops off and goes Fran into Vieira, or Fran into Balthier revive Kites, give the Fran haste, play a Vieira, start developing backups, and it's completely immovable. And I've also seen this deck just lose to a single Amaterasu on the Fran at the start of the game, or a Shantoto if they can't find the Kites, right? So Ninjas, again, Wind Lightning I think is actually very well positioned, and Ninjas are kind of a weird Wind Lightning core that can't play the Storm Engine, but gets to do other interesting things instead. I think for that reason, it stands a chance as a tier 3 deck. Dragoons, I think it's a big buff thanks to the printing of the FF8 package. I think it's a very natural home to adopt. Alright, it'll very naturally adopt the FF8 package. I think that you'll run 38 Dragoons with 6 honorary Dragoons and Fujin and Raijin. And then because you're running Fujin and Raijin, Cypher, Idia, and Ultimate should make a lot of sense. And I think you could just run 37 Dragoons and then 13 non-Dragoons and call it a day. Cat 4, there's a lot of ability-based removal going around right now with Refia, and Cecil is very good at preventing one targeted removal per turn. It's a little bit worse into the Ferris side of that deck, so you'd have to solve for that. But the Wind Cecil is actually very good into that. So there's definitely a lot of interesting things you can do with a Category 4 focused deck. Ice Earth similarly could be a premier control deck if it gets figured out. Similarly, mono ice control. I personally would be on Earth and still considering even running the Kurasame there if I was going to play mono ice. But Kurasame is a very strong card, one worth threatening, and threatening Kurasame can often cause your opponent to play into a Shinryu. Lastly, I think Cloud Pod is still kind of slept on and underdeveloped. I think it doesn't have to be. I think it's even the potential to be like a Scions where the Cloud Pod engine is like 5 cards. It's like 3 copies of Cloud, a Rosa, and a Warrior of Light, and they're all just generically decent cards anyway. In any deck that can generate Earth and Fire CP. Rogue, these are a lot of decks that I have seen people play and have interesting things about them, but I just wouldn't expect to see at top tables. Archfiend's really, really cool deck, just also one that needs 3 turns to set up. And I think for that reason, also has a pretty bad Shinryu weakness, so I would probably have this a little lower. Avalanche, again, just has not aged particularly well. It's just a little slow to set up and do what it wants to do, and because it's slower than 13, and it's kind of just like worse 13 for the most part. Dancers are kind of still one good card away. Lilithset is Mayakov Lilithset is still completely oppressive and actually very good at dealing with cards like Ferris and Refia, but you really don't have good Wind Dancers you want to play. Like the rest of the dancers are just not up to the quality of Mayakov and Lilithset by themselves. So we're still kind of like waiting on whatever that is going to look like. Golbez, this card still, as far as like Opus 1 forwards, will still just kind of cheese games out of nowhere. They'll drop the Golbez and then Delita, put 5 forwards, put you on damage 1 or 2 immediately, and you're dead the next turn. Black Mages could be interesting with Refia running everywhere and Giga Wall running everywhere, but it really isn't particularly good into Knights or a lot of the 4-color good stuff decks. I could see this rising to tier 3 if the right pilot or build comes around, but it's just such an unproven archetype that I'm a little hesitant to put it higher. Sky Pirates, this is the deck that plays like the 60p Vaughn, and you try to, I call it critical mass Sky Pirates. Shinryu and the Goddess were really big buffs for this deck, but it really hasn't gotten anything in the last set. I don't think Redis really changes very much about Sky Pirates that it didn't already have. And actually, I think Redis opens up a Shinryu weakness even further than it already was dealing with. Guardians, the FF10 starter, still has a good card, still can be really annoying, can get very big in a hurry, and even run people down very quickly, but ultimately I think that the power level of these cards just is not quite up to snuff. Same thing kind of for Kingsglaive. And that is it. That is my tier list for Hidden Hope. I have probably missed a couple. This was put together a little quicker than I usually do. So if I missed a deck, or if there's anything you go, cool, what are you talking about? This deck is so much worse than you're giving it credit for. Feel free, drop it in the comments down below. Looking forward to seeing all of you in Kansas, and should be a lot of fun.